Hi guys, this is the Acryla-gouache and watercolor demo, and I put down a little bit of blue on the canvas on some thinner paper than usual so I can get some nice textures and things for the rocks and for clouds, and that was applied with a big 1.5 inch brush. Those are cerulean watercolor. Now I'm using some Van Dyke brown for the trees, and I'm just painting transparently over the tree trunks, palm tree trunks, just to see a little bit of that blue come through, because these are the trees that are far away. But over here on the right, I'm painting the tree in the foreground that's closer with a darker wash of that Van Dyke brown. Later I'm going to go back in there with some darker Acryla-gouache browns that are more opaque. But I want to make sure that I put all the little colors down first for the underpainting. And I use watercolor first because that's always what I do when I paint in a piece with watercolor and Acryla-gouache, so that I can move the paint around, I can lift, I can adjust things, I can fix mistakes, and I can set everything up before the more permanent paint, the Acryla-gouache, goes down later in the painting phase. Here I'm just adding a little bit of hooker's green to the palm leaves and the palm tree canopy. And then I'm going to add a little bit more down here in the foreground to make it darker and a little more, rather more opaque than the trees in the background. So this is how the tree in the foreground will start, and I'll work in some opaques afterwards with Acryla-gouache, but I really want to darken that up, darken the leaves that are further away or in the shadows toward the middle of the tree, etc. And I want to set it up like this so I can come back later and perhaps lift away some greens for lights. But I got to keep that in mind, because when I put Acryla-gouache down, sometimes the watercolor will come up, but it's very rare that it comes up unless you really scrub into it and almost go in there and try to lift out the paint. So it's a really good process because the watercolor will stay down. Of course, you got to let it dry first, but if you really scrub into it, it'll come up. You're able to lift it, and you can do all sorts of things even while you're working with Acryla-gouache. And I'll put some watercolor on top of the Acryla-gouache at the end to show you what it looks like. So watercolor is an integral part of this painting process, even though it's going to be mostly Acryla-gouache in the end, which is what this is. So this is a mixture of Acryla-gouache, and it's the first Acryla-gouache that I'm putting down on the canvas. It's a little bit of a neutral gray, number 3, and a sky blue, which is basically like a cooler version of the cerulean. It's called SkyBlue in the Holbein Acryla-gouache set. So, right now we're getting almost like a grayish viridian green. It's not quite as saturated as the straight out of the tube viridian, which does come with your set. But I wanted to put this down because, I want those nice cool greens to complement the colors I'm going to put on next, which are these nice brownish rock colors and almost flesh tones, because it's it's an island and it's sandy, and I want it to be a little yellow, but mostly that ashy rose color, that grayish rose or red in the end. So what I'm doing now is, since the light source is on the left and it's coming from almost like a 45-degree angle, I'm painting in mostly the darks on the right sides of the rocks and toward the bottom of the rocks, and leaving the tops and left sides of the rocks the blue of the sky, because that's where the second color is going to go. And this is some sort of unusual, whimsical looking island. It has many levels. It's like a mountain island, but on which some trees have grown, and some grasses and some fruits and things. Right here, I'm using the horizontal rock painting technique, where I'm just raking the brush from left to right. Of course, when you're doing this, you need some really, really good reference. You need a bunch of rock references, maybe like 5 to 10 cliff and rock and stone and boulder references. This one I'm using a reference for, and I'm looking at the reference while I'm painting. I was looking at the reference while I was drawing and looking at the reference while I'm sort of drawing with the brush and with the paint, because I'm changing things around. I'm not following the drawing to a T. In the end, this is going to look very, very different than the drawing and the different planes I drew in first for the rocks and the boulders and cliffs. I'm sort of improvising, adding things in. And even when I add in the next color, it's going to change. The textures of rocks will change, and much of this will be different. So now I'm adding a little bit of that true rock color in the context of my painting, at least. And it's just this sort of like orangish brown. It's a little bit of ash rose and some yellow ochre. So if you don't have the ash rose Acryla-gouache, you can mix ash rose with a little bit of yellow ochre, just a dab, a tiny, tiny, tiny amount, almost like pinhead size of wine red, and a little bit of your neutral gray number 3. And if you wanted to go lighter, neutral gray number 2, just like a light gray, basically, that you can mix with your black and white. They also sell a range of neutral grays that you've probably seen in previous videos. And I buy these neutral grays just to save time and meet deadlines and things and paint faster. It just saves me the time of mixing up a gray with black and white. Now here I'm painting all the upper left sides of the rocks, just to get sort of like base shapes down of that mixture, that brown mixture. Later I'm going to go over that sort of greenish, grayish viridian with a little bit of watercolor, and you'll see that it sets it back. It distances it from the foreground and makes it recede. But this is the second step. I've got my shadows, now I'm painting my midtones, and then in the third step, after this, you'll see that I add some highlights and some textures to the rocks, which really, really brings them out. Now it just looks like a bunch of simple flat shapes. But that's how it starts, just like any other painting. But you see the trees still look like they're far away. They still got a little blue in them. And they're really simply painted. You'll of course add a little more detail to the tree in the foreground on the right, on the other set of rocks that are closer to us, where perhaps we're standing. Now what I'm doing is, that I have some shapes and things, I'm just using a little bit more water, but the same paint, to blend those brownish shapes into the green, and to continue to paint more rock textures that are in the shadows and that are darker and further away from light source on the left. This is the good thing about acrylic gouache. If you add more water to it, it's very, very easy to blend it. And the green is not going to come up after it's dry, because it dries, like I've been saying, it dries like acrylic. So you can go in there and make all sorts of different, little rock textures. I've painted an acrylic gouache background and added in some gouache or acrylic gouache over the top to make nebula and clouds and things, and it just works beautifully. It's very, very easy to use. Now I'm just adding some highlight textures to the rocks. I mixed up a sort of like a sandy rock color, like a sandstone color. That's looks a lot like a flesh tone, but I wanted these rocks to be like the brownish variety of rocks and cliffs and things, because it's in the ocean, it's an island, it's tropical climate. So now I'm just making big strokes on the left, making sure to cover the original brown color, but then as I progress toward the right, I'm using smaller brush strokes, little stipples, and tiny little marks so that I can get some nice detail, and so that the highlights of the rocks sort of fade into the shadows of the Terminator. So just, it's pretty similar to what I did with the original brown. I'm putting down the shapes now, the overall shapes. I know they're more detailed, but then I'm going to come in again after wiping off my brush and adding a little more water to blend those hard edge detail highlights into the midtones. And what I'm doing now is making sure that these little details that I'm brushing in, mostly horizontally, look like rock textures. I want the rocks, of course, to look like rocks. I want them to be broken and eroded. And these are rocks on an island in the ocean, so they're going to be really weathered. There's going to be a lot of history, the wrinkles and cracks and little clefts of those rocks. So I want there to be a lot of these little tiny, tiny strokes, mostly to the right side of those larger highlight shapes. And sometimes I go back in and I connect my larger highlight shapes and make them bigger. I modify things. And that's what I was saying before, the drawing changes. This looks almost nothing like the original details in the drawing or the different planes that I drew to sort of model those rocks or render those rocks out with my line work. Now I'm adding, like I was saying, a little more water so I can blend in those hard edge shapes of highlights into the midtones, but I don't want to cover the midtones. I still want the midtones to be there. I want that progression of highlight, midtone, and dark value, tint, tone, and shade. And I want it to be smooth in some areas. I want there to be hard edges in other areas. And that's the key to painting, pretty much anything. You want a good balance always of soft and hard edges, of sharp and sort of fuzzy edges. And again, I've said this before, when I started this piece, I started with the background, and I started with the objects that were further away. Then I worked forward. I always work from the background forward, from the background to the midground, and then to the foreground. So that's why I'm painting more details and more darks into this tree now, after I've painted a lot of that midground island. And I'm just roughly putting in some shadows on the left, and making this tree look more like it has segments, as it is a pine tree. And I'm making this little spot right here darker because that leaf is casting a shadow over it. And then I'm just going in there with a little bit of water and rendering in some rough textures, because sometimes pine trees are a little like fuzzy, or they have bristles, or they have little pieces of bark hanging off and things like that. So I want it to be a little rough. And then lastly, I'm going to take just straight paint and paint the darks and the shadows, just very, very dark, so that tree really stands out. And if you look at the rest of the painting on the left, it really, really stands out because it's a little more saturated, it's darker, there's more detail, the edges are sharper, and I'm using a different paint. The trees in the background are watercolor. They're more opaque. They're more translucent, and they're lighter and not as saturated. So the tree in the foreground is a lot darker. And it's because I've used a more opaque paint. I'm using a lot more of this Acryla-gouache in the foreground. So now I'm adding a little bit of this yellowish color. It's a mixture of ash yellow and yellow ochre. I just want the leaves to look a little old, or on their way to sort of drying out. Maybe they're not getting enough sun or enough water. Now I'm adding a little more watercolor. I'm getting back to the watercolor here on top of the Acryla-gouache so that I can sort of set it back. I'm dabbing away so it doesn't get onto those little mid-tone rock colors. But you'll see that when it dries, this is going to make the rock structure, and the cliffs look like they're further back because there's more of that sky color in there. And this is just a mixture of watercolor cerulean blue and a little bit of watercolor titanium white, Winsor Newton. So that's the great part about acrylic gouache, and that's my point in this demo, is to show you that you can start the painting with watercolor, which is very versatile, and you can do all sorts of things, mess around with it, and then you put the acrylic gouache on, which is permanent. But you can also put some watercolor on top of the acrylic gouache after you're done with the painting or halfway through, and you can mess around with it. You can put all sorts of washes and mosses and things on your rocks. You can set them back with a little bit of that, the paint that I was using, for instance. And you could even go back into your watercolor background and just lift away with a lot of water and then a lot of wiping of your brush, so that you're not just putting the pigment back down on the page with that water. And this is something that's a little harder to do with acrylic gouache. So it's great that the watercolor's still down there. I can work back into it. I specifically painted it with these clouds in mind when I did the original wash underpainting, because I knew that I was going to lift out some clouds. And that combination of a really, really opaque, different medium in front and on top of the watercolor distances the midground and foreground objects from the watercolor objects, which are mostly in the background, the sky, the trees. It's just that beautiful contrasting opacity, because the watercolor, of course, isn't as opaque as their acrylic gouache, and that's what helps it recede. So now, a couple little spots came up, so I'm just gonna take some of my paint them back in. I was using a paper that I don't normally use for the demo, so the paint didn't stay down as much. And now I'm just painting in some other greens, so I can get a little color variety for the different bushes and things and shrubberies, and making sure that those are in there too. Whenever I go off screen like that, I'm usually wiping my brush off, or I'm mixing a little paint, or I'm spraying a little bit of water onto my palette knife. And in this case, I just grabbed a couple highlight colors for the palm tree leaves. And I'm just quickly throwing in some highlights just to show you how I would start doing that. But eventually you'll get to these detail steps, and for most of you, that's the easy part. It's this underlying structure, the combination of media, and all the steps I've showed you that are really, really important. And you'll see that, like I was saying in the other video, layering acrylic gouache is very easy. You got to use a lot of water. Remember to use a lot of water. Water is not a bad thing when you're using acrylic gouache. The ratio of water to paint is very important, but add more water, and acrylic gouache goes further. It wants you to use more water as opposed to other mediums, which when you add water just become globby and make blots on the page, or don't do what you want them to do. So I'm just using a little bit of a raw umber mixed with a light green. My acrylic gouache sets to darken things up, just so that the tree looks more three-dimensional. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.